Good morning. Hope I can have my presentation up. And our topic is the delay of parousia. How long, O Lord? Many consider Waiting for Godot the greatest play of the 20th century. And the play was written originally in French by Samuel Beckett, an Irish playwright in the 1950s. The two main characters of the play are Vladimir and Estragon, who wait for the arrival of a man named Godot, and they do that by a leafless tree, as you can see on the slide. While waiting, they discuss a variety of issues at length. All these issues are trivial, insignificant issues. They are not certain who this Godot is. They do not know whether they have ever met him, and even they are not sure if he will arrive at all. But they are waiting, and waiting. In one moment, the boy shows up and explains to Vladimir and Estragon that he is a messenger from Godot. His message is that Godot delays his coming. He will not arrive today, but he will come tomorrow. Vladimir asks for a description of Godot, but he receives only extremely brief, extremely vague answers from the boy. Vladimir and Estragon are waiting, and they get despaired. But Godot never arrives. It seems that this play reflects some of the greatest challenges that Adventism faces today. We are waiting for the second coming of Christ for almost 2,000 years as Christians and for almost 200 years as Adventists, but we are still on the earth. And the inevitable question is, what happened? Can we talk about the delay of the second coming? And if yes, for what reason? No question, one of the most outstanding difficulties contemporary Adventists faces is how to keep alive the hope for the second coming of Jesus. Angel Rodriguez, one of the most well-known Adventist theologians, writes in one of his recent publications, published last year. He says, "I wonder why the Christian hope, a matter of significant importance, does not seem to be, to many church members, a matter of major concern. There is a little talk about the second coming of Christ, and we tend to live as if time will last indefinitely. The element of expectation appears to be in intensive care, and consequently, the life of a believer is in many ways indistinguishable from that of unbelievers. Many of those who are sitting on our pews seem to be facing almost a crisis of eschatological hope." Very, very strong statement. Clearly, we as a church, we need a revival of the Advent hope. Because without a vibrant Advent hope, we cannot speak of Adventism. The Advent hope is closely linked to the core of Adventism, to its identity, to its theology, to its mission. But in order to experience a vibrant and intelligent Advent hope in 21st century, we need to deal with some inevitable difficult questions. What makes our eschatological expectations certain? How to interpret the parousia in an interaction with the contemporary culture that it may really shine as a true hope, a hope which is appealing, a hope which is relevant. There are many, many questions, but among the many questions, there is a key question which lies at the heart of the matter. And that question is related to the reality that we are still on the earth and we are still waiting for the second coming of Christ. From the very beginning, Adventism was rooted in the expectation of the soon coming of Christ. The conviction that Jesus' coming is close, that it is at the door, was for generations the engine of Adventism, the mainspring of Adventism. But the reality today, however, is that Adventism has gradually drifted away from the strong sense of imminence. The critical factor was the passing of the time. And with the passing of the time, the expectation of the impending second coming was more and more difficult to sustain. Let me give you several examples. When the First World War broke out, many Adventists said that this is the sign, this is the end. We have never seen a world war so far in the history. Even Arthur Daniels, who was the General Conference president at that time, wrote a book published in 1917 in which he argues that the war is in close relation to Armageddon. And remember that in this war, Turkey was very, very much involved. But a surprise happened. Turkey was defeated. In 1918, the war ended. But only 2 decades later, a new world war started, the Second World War, and many Adventists said that's surely the end. After a period of false peace, the Armageddon is at hand. But what happened? The Second World War ended. But then, in 1961, John Kennedy was elected as the President of America. And he was the first Catholic president in the history of the United States. And by the way, Joe Biden is the second Catholic president in the history of the United States. And back in 1961, many Adventists said, this is a major sign of the times. Catholic president of America. This is the time when the Sunday law will be issued. But what happened? In 1963, Kennedy was assassinated, and the Sunday law was not issued. Or let's go back not that much in time. When the COVID pandemic broke out less than 3 years ago, many Adventists believed that we should see it as a sign of the end. And the globalist regime prophesied in Revelation 13 is just around the corner. Many thought that with the COVID-19 vaccination, the imposition of the mark of the beast came. The reality is that many Adventists got tired with such an approach to the eschaton. They got tired of constant whipping up of emotions when an event happens on the political scene. They got tired of finding constantly new signs to interpret. The time was passing, and as with other millenarian groups, the passing of time brought an identity crisis. So the matter of the delay of the second coming poses a challenge which penetrates to the very core of who we are and what we do. It's a real issue. In the next few minutes, I will discuss 5 different reactions to the problem of delay in Adventist circles. Some of these issues are not reactions are not mutually exclusive. How do Adventists respond to this problem? The first response I suggest is intensification of the sense of apocalyptic imminence. Whenever major crisis hits the world, interpretation of the signs of times undergoes a revival. This happens also in some non-Adventist evangelical circles. Recently, this happened related to the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, which some pastors and church members see as a sign of the last days. My comment is, creating an atmosphere of urgency may spark a revival, and it may lead to intensified mission activities, but what remains when the excitement is gone? If you read carefully the New Testament, you will see that Jesus strongly warned against any form of religion which relies heavily on outward signs or miracles. Generating false excitement is unbiblical, but even more, it is irresponsible. A wiser way is to live every day for the glory of the Lord by advancing His kingdom as if one were running a marathon and not a 100-meter sprint. A second response in our circles to the problem of the delay is what I call eschatological burnout. If we intensively focus on the conditions in the world, if we constantly chase fulfillment of the signs of the times, whenever a new world crisis or natural disaster hits, we can easily experience emotional fatigue. As a result, we become weary of waiting, and we may start looking as losers. Some would even experience a deep crisis of faith. Some would even slip into disbelief. Remember that our faith and our disciple-making should not be based on excitement. Let I quote here a well-known Adventist theologian, Fritz Guy, who says, "Hope is not euphoria. Its eagerness is complemented by a patience that gives hope its resilience and durability so that it can survive delay and disappointment without disillusionment." The third reaction in Adventists to the problem of delay is focusing on human responsibility for the delay. The too long waiting for the second coming has prompted some Adventists to raise the question, who is responsible for the delay? Who is responsible for the fact that Jesus has not returned yet? And their answer is ecclesiological. Their answer is that something is wrong with the church. The church is the responsible. Something is wrong which needs to be corrected before the coming of the Lord could happen. The essential proposition of this approach is that the second coming is heavily dependent on human accomplishment. And this theory is known as the last generation theory, and also in some older scholarly literature, harvest principle is used as a technical term. According to this theory, which is a construct, Christ will not return until two conditions are met. Condition number one is the readiness of God's people. And what does this readiness mean? It means that a significant number of church members reach a perfection of character. And the second condition is finishing of the work, which is done by dedicated preaching of the gospel to all people in the world. And when all will hear and God's people will have a mature character, then Jesus can come, because we made the condition for that. The bottom line is the following. The end of the coming or delaying of the parousia depends on what? It depends on the success of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Okay? The problematic theory. Some of the best critical responses to this theory were published just several years ago in 2018. 3 brilliant books. One is a monograph written by Andrews professors, God's Character and the Last Generation. The second is a historical study by George Knight, who very nicely showed step by step how this mindset infiltrated Adventism. It's a brilliant reading. I was shocked when I read it. Step by step. How did it infiltrate Adventist thinking? And the third is by Rainer Brisma, well-known European theologian. Very briefly, a bit critical interaction with this idea. According to my opinion, the last generation theology is vulnerable on several grounds. Number one, we viewed from salvation historical viewpoint, God has never waited for the success of any human factors to deliver almighty acts. Read the Bible, you will see that God cooperates with human beings, human agencies in carrying out His plans. But He is consistent in making decisions independent of human achievement. Just read the Bible and you will see that. Flood, He cooperates with Noah, but He does not depend on him. Exodus, return from Babylon, even the first Advent. When the time came, God sent His Son. Okay. The second problem, the second difficulty with this review is that it ignores God's sovereignty. So God's sovereignty becomes subjected to human agency. Well, if humans would be in position to hasten the parousia by their efforts, that would mean a very strong salvation by works emphasis. So no question, we have a part to play in the plan of salvation, but who is the Lord of the space and time? God is the ultimate Lord of everything. Third problem. If the second coming is dependent on human work, what are the chances that the parousia will occur? As you know, the number of non-Christians in our world who have not heard the gospel is increasing rapidly every day. So the present situation certainly does not allow for imminent return of Christ. And lastly, the fourth point, if we follow the logic of the harvest principle, the existence of some generations is the result of the weak life of previous generation. So why I am here now in 2022? Because someone did not do the job before me. Okay? We are here today because our predecessors did not develop a mature character. They did not finish the preaching of the gospel. And this reasoning is highly, highly problematic. Why? Because the bottom line is that some generations are unplanned, okay? And some generations, as our generation exists, merely because of the weakness of the previous generations. And such thinking clearly relegates some generations of God's people to second-class status, which is completely not in harmony with the biblical anthropology. The fourth response in Adventist Church is focusing on the healing aspect of the gospel. As a consequence of delay, in the last several decades, the apocalyptic aspect of the gospel has started to be counterbalanced by an emphasis on the healing aspect of the gospel. It has been recognized that in spite of the future orientation, Adventist needs to make difference here and now. It needs to have a concern to make this world a better place instead of being pessimistic about it. And this requires social engagement on our parts, not retreating and waiting only for an eschatological holocaust. I personally do not see these two aspects of the gospel, the apocalyptic aspect and the healing aspect, as mutually exclusive. They need to go hand in hand. A balance is needed, a healthy, balanced Adventism in 21st century. Overemphasizing either of the sides of the gospel leads to distorted discipleship and unbalanced relationship to the Adventist hope. The fifth response, and the final response, is asking the so what question. This came as a reaction to Adventism's early obsession with the signs of times. Some Adventist scholars pointed out that we should start asking more important questions than what is Pope doing in Vatican or what is the USA President doing in Washington. There are more important questions on matters related to the second coming. For example, what is the meaning of the Advent hope? How is it relevant for our life in the contemporary world today? How can we present it practically to make difference, especially for young people, in everyday life? And do I know the one who is coming? Do I have a living relationship with him? How are we to interpret responsibly, exegetically, the prophetic and apocalyptic biblical texts without reading in the text our contemporary concerns and events, and so on, so on? Two names in Adventist theology which gave a major contribution into going into this direction were Sake Kubo, who was a former principal of the Newbold College, and the other name is Hans Larondel, according to my assessment, one of the greatest theologians in the history of Adventist Church. According to my opinion, by shifting away from concern with the imminence of second coming Adventist Church has not lost its character. Moving away from date-setting or almost date-setting mechanisms is a sign of a mature faith and not the abandoning of our cause. And finally, let's raise a critical question at the end. Dare we believe that Jesus is coming soon? Yes. The answer is yes. Most definitely, he's coming soon. Of course, if you look at things chronologically, 2,000 years is a short period of time, maybe for God. For us, it's a long period of time. But if you think salvation historically, as the biblical authors were thinking, okay, things look quite differently. To understand this matter and to give a correct answer to this question, we need to pay very careful attention to the nature of New Testament eschatology. And this helps to resolve the tension. So, look at the biblical storyline on the slide. Here are the different acts in salvation history in God's drama. And you can see on the slide that the central event, the climax of the history, is the Christ event, the coming of Christ, his crucifixion, his resurrection, his ascension. This is the key event. As the famous Swiss theologian Oscar Kuhlmann would say, Christ is the center of the time. Okay, and after that, we are in the fifth phase of the history, preaching of the gospel. The end time starts because the key event is over, okay? And the next step in God's plan is the second coming. So it is close. It is the next step. So it's near, it's close, no question. If you think not chronologically, but salvation historically, as the biblical authors all were thinking. And that's why they say it's close, it's near, because it is the next step in God's major plan. So, in our era, the time factor is not a matter of significance, because the distance between the two advents should not be measured chronologically, but by such concerns as the realization of God's plan. And the next step in this plan is the second coming, so it is clearly near. And at the very end, let I suggest to you that this mode of thinking, the biblical mode of thinking, the salvation historical mode of thinking, same way of thinking that biblical authors had, this mode of thinking frees us from being burdened with the matter of delay or with the direction of current political developments. We are free from that. And this mode of thinking helps us to appreciate God's plan, in which he demonstrates such a loyalty to his created world that he will not take shortcuts that do not work in handling the problem of evil. And that's why we are still here. God is not taking shortcuts. When he's solving the problems in cosmic conflict, he will solve them at their root. And he knows how and when. And we can say only, Maranatha, Lord, come, Lord Jesus, when the time comes and when he thinks that it is the appropriate time. Thank you for your attention.